Hello, everybody. We're just waiting for the room to fill up before we get started. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event. My name is Julie Andrews. I'm the director of the Lindenhall Library. And normally at this point, I'd say welcome to the Lindenhall Library, but welcome to the virtual Lindenhall Library. So the Lindenhall Library is pleased to host this event in partnership with the Wiener Holocaust Library and the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. The event is part of the National Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which is taking place across the UK between the 12th and the 22nd of November. Being Human is the only national festival of the humanities run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Tonight's event will bring together two institutions, the Lindenhall Library and the Wiener Holocaust Library. Both organisations have examined the longer term legacies of difficult histories, and we will examine the impact of the history on families. We've decided this evening to be a taster preview for a series of events we will host next year in the Lindenhall Library in Belfast as pandemic conditions permit. I think when we talked about this, probably 6 months ago, we honestly believed we would be having it in the Lindenhall tonight. This series will provide participants the opportunity to discover the history of a little known archive, the International Tracing Service, created to find missing people after the Holocaust. We'll have conversations with leading Holocaust historian Dan Stone as he uncovers new aspects of Holocaust history and its legacies, as well as a pop-up exhibition which he co-curated with Wiener Holocaust Library's Deputy Director and Head of Research, Dr. Christine Schmidt. And finally, we'll host a hands-on family research workshop led by Jason Burke of the Lindenhall, as well as the Wiener Holocaust Library's researchers, Mary Frabitz and Elise Bath, where participants can learn how to begin their own research and find out about our resources and support our institutions offer. We really do look forward to welcoming you to the Lindenhall Library as soon as we can, and hopefully early in 2021. In the meantime, Being Human events are mostly online this year, and you can see the full programme online at www.beinghumanfestival.org. The festival can be found at Being Human Fest on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and the hashtag as #BeingHuman2020. Please help us to keep as many festival events as possible free, and to improve the festival in years to come by taking a moment to fill in a feedback survey which will circulate shortly. Your feedback is very valuable. Finally, if you'd like to help support the festival by making a donation, please go to the www.beinghumanfestival.org support us. Tonight we'll have about an hour of formal remarks from our panellists, followed by Q&A. Your microphones will be muted, but you can enter a question in the chat at any time, and we will have time after the first hour to get as many as possible. Our speakers tonight include Professor Dan Stone, Director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London, Dr. Christine Schmidt, Deputy Director and Head of Research at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, Elise Bath and Mary Frabitz, Senior International Tracing Service Archive Researchers at the Wiener Holocaust Library, and Jason Burke, Arts and Cultural Programmer at the Lindenhall Library in Belfast. And I'd like now to hand over to Dan Stone. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for the kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be doing this event, and I look forward to round 2 when we can actually do it properly in Belfast in due course. When the event takes place in Belfast in due course, I will give a longer lecture about a specific topic, one of the things that you can find in the ITS archive, and that's the topic of the death marches, the forced evacuations of concentration camp inmates at the end of the war, as they were forcibly marched back towards Germany, mostly in the face of the Red Army advance. But what I'm going to do tonight, I'll just spend 20 minutes or so introducing you to this archive and give you a kind of whistle-stop tour of some of the themes that you can explore in that archive. So I'm going to share my screen, if I can get the right thing. Hope people can see that. Is that there? Something? Yeah, okay. Last year, the institution renamed itself the Arolsen Archives, named after the town in which it's located, Bad Arolsen in Hesse in central Germany. But until then, and the archive itself is still known as the International Tracing Service, or ITS. And I won't spend time tonight on the institutional history of ITS, but suffice it to say, it's quite complicated, quite interesting, bound up with Cold War politics and the needs of the military and the Western allies in particular, as they discovered huge numbers of displaced persons, refugees in Germany, and as they realized at the end of the war that the question of tracing missing people was going to be a much larger one than they had anticipated. So requests started coming in to various bodies, including private charities, from the middle of the war onwards. And at the end of the war, the Allies formalized this process and created an institution which by the start of 1948 became known as the International Tracing Service. It was run from 1955, when the International Committee of the Red Cross took over administration of ITS. It was then run as a kind of closed tracing service until 2007, when the Red Cross was forced finally to open the archive after a great deal of pressure from international organizations. They'd always claimed that there was nothing much of interest there for historians, saying it was just a tracing service, nothing particularly special in there. It turns out, in fact, that in this archive there are over 30 million documents, including many original wartime records. So amongst those 30 million or so, over 100 million pages of documents, there are to be found what the ITS calls factual documents. That's to say, wartime records relating to, for example, concentration camp registration lists, clothing lists, deportation lists, and all sorts of records of that sort, as well as other bodies of information relating to specific institutions within the Third Reich that have somehow wound their way up in the archive. Then there are all the post-war records relating to displaced persons, DP camps, the documents relating to survivors' trajectories as refugees. The International Refugee Organization was set up to help resettle people after the war, and all the documentation relating to people's applications for resettlement, what happened to them, appeals processes, and so on, are all there in ITS. There's also 3 million, more than 3 million now, so-called tracing and documentation files. And that's to say, every time somebody submitted a request to ITS to trace a relative, ITS would open a file on that person, as they still do. It still is a tracing service. And there are over 3 million of these files, each of which contains information, sometimes photographs, documents, witness statements, testimonies, and so on, relating to that particular individual. So there's and there's much more besides. So it's absolutely vast. It's extraordinary to see. It's been called, for good reason, a paper monument. It is in itself a kind of stunning commemoration of the Third Reich's crimes. But more than that now, it's also, although it is still a tracing service, it has become, in partnership with other countries that belong to its governing body, including the UK, a major research institution, as we'll hear. It's also an important resource for family research, as we'll hear from Elise and Mary and Jason a bit later on. And ITS, together with the Wiener Library and other bodies, is in the process of spreading information about what it holds there through scholarly research, through public events, and many other sorts of activities. So it's now one of the most important fixtures, if you like, in Germany on the landscape of Holocaust commemoration. So, but when I talk about the Holocaust in this case, with respect to the ITS, I'm not only talking about Jewish victims of Nazi persecution, because ITS holds vast amounts of information relating to non-Jewish prisoners in the Third Reich, in the regular prison system, as well as in concentration camps and other sorts of camps. There are records on some 17 million individuals in ITS. The largest single collection within it is the so-called Central Name Index, which is the collection of originally box files with cards on that the ITS used as the basis for their tracing purposes. So what I want to do now really is just to give you a sense of some of the documents that you can find in ITS, with particular reference to some of the things that I've been working on in the project that I've been doing on ITS. So that includes slave labor, the use of concentration camp inmates as slave laborers by the Nazis and their cooperators. That's to say, the many firms across Germany and Austria that made use of slave labor, by looking at the death marches that I already mentioned, the liberation of the camps, and in particular, I'll come at the end to a separate branch of the ITS, which was the child search branch, because one of the things that the Allies discovered at the end of the war was that there were far more unaccompanied children in Europe than they had expected, and very few survivors of camps who were liberated for obvious reasons. Most children were killed, but quite large numbers of children who appeared in German orphanages and foster homes and other such institutions whose heritage, it transpired, was outside of Germany, and who'd ended up in Germany either because they'd been taken to be Germanized, as the Nazis called it, because they had the correct racial characteristics, or because they'd been lost, separated from their usually mothers at the end of the war, women who were often forced laborers, non-Jewish forced laborers, largely from Eastern Europe, who were separated in the chaos at the end of the war. So this is quite a complicated search operation in its own right. What you're looking at here is this tracing chart from the annual report of ITS from 1949. The figures themselves don't matter particularly, but if you look at each of one of these, what I assume are meant to be little urns, which is quite a curious device to use to show the tracing process, indicates to you how many requests that they were getting and how many cases the ITS was able to answer. And because what you see here is the dark colored urns show people who were found alive, and others who were found dead. But for the most part, there's no coloring at all. And that is an indication of the difficulty of the ITS's task. So the ITS regarded as a positive outcome for a tracing request, finding out whether somebody was alive or dead. A negative request simply meant they couldn't find information about a particular person. And that was the outcome, I think, for the majority of cases that the ITS tried to investigate. It was an extremely complex process, as you can imagine, simply in terms of logistics, access to resources. I mean, the things that we don't really think about now, but access to pens and papers and petrol and vehicles, all of these things were extraordinarily difficult for the field workers in the first years after the war. And even after ITS started doing tracing solely on the basis of the documents and not sending people out into the field, the success rate was still pretty low. So that gives you.
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Sorry. Could I ask you to turn your slideshow on?
Slideshow?
Yeah, because it's a bit small on some screens.
I see.
So
yep,
if you
no
could
problem.
just, thank you, sorry.
Yep. Oh no, that's not what I want. there's a shot of the central name index from a few years ago, which gives you a little sense of the vast size of this thing. That's just one little bit of it. I've skipped through all this institutional stuff. Is that better? Sorry, that was.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, okay, good. So there you can see that in the same year, that by the end of 1949, they'd already discovered in the documents nearly 17 million names. So the central name index was nearly at the size that it is today. Because what the people who worked at ITS were interested in was collecting these records, not for the sorts of purposes that we historians would use them today. That's, you know, to analyze the slave labor system, for example. They simply extracted names from all these documents. They kept the documents, but they only wanted names from them. And then they, in the ITS jargon, they carded them. That's to say they produced a card relating to that particular person, and then eventually came up with a system of phonetically arranging them alphabetically, because of course many of the particularly Eastern European names could be spelt in many different ways, and found a way of cross-referencing them so that they could identify people more easily. Here you can see the building that is still the home of the Arolsen archives being built in the early 1950s. You can see that I use this picture because you can see the sort of working conditions that the tracers were working in, surrounded by these mounds of paper, trying to make sense of what was going on. These murals, I think, are quite interesting. They supposedly have been lost. I don't really believe it. I think they're hidden in a cupboard somewhere in Arolsen, but they're really they're quite striking, and I think it would be nice if they could be discovered. There's the others. You see, I think the list of names of camps there, some of which are still relatively unknown, but gives an indication of the scope of ITS's work, that they themselves produced a kind of catalogue of the Nazi camps, which has been in first edition was in 1949, I think, and then subsequent editions thereafter, which contains information on huge numbers of little known sites across Nazi occupied and Axis Europe. And there's just a tiny selection of names. So I want to just talk a little bit first about slave labor and the use of slave labor. This list just gives you, I've chosen it a kind of more or less at random, just because this gives you a small sense of the scale of companies that were using slave labor in the Third Reich. This is one particular site, the Durenfurt, a subsidiary of IG Farben, and here you see a list of all sorts of different companies that were working with slave laborers being supplied for Durenfurt. Here you can see a bill, and I think the thing that's fascinating about ITS in general, I think, from a historian's point of view, is that you can trace the trajectories of individuals through the Nazi camp system. You can produce a kind of history of the Holocaust from below, if you like, or a grassroots history. I'll come back to that. But there's also a huge amount on perpetrator documents of this sort relating to slave labor. And I include this one here because it gives you a good sense of the dehumanizing language with which the Nazis spoke about what they were doing. So here you see the price per Jew per day for the work that they were doing. That's a fee, of course, not a payment to the slave laborers themselves, but the cost to the firms of using the Jews. And there's a one particular bill. This one is quite interesting because it contains at the bottom, you see the little swastika mark. That's what we would now refer to as a kind of kite mark for excellence. There's a sort of commendation of this firm. And there you can see that it's a demand for payment for construction. This one I found I spent quite a lot of time looking at the sub camps, so the slave labor camps that were attached to Gross Rosen. Gross Rosen is, I think, in the English speaking world, probably the least known of the Nazis' major concentration camps, located in what's today Western Poland, in a fairly remote part of the country. It grew massively, and by the end of the war, it held about 76,000, or sorry, at the start of 1945, it held about 76,000 inmates, so approximately 11% of the total concentration camp population. And it had about 100 sub-camps attached to it, including Oskar Schindler's workshop, including the camps associated with building, constructing sites for Hitler in the Eulen or Owl Mountains, and various other camps. Many camps for Jewish women, particularly for Hungarian Jewish women and women who'd been shipped from either Auschwitz or from the Łódź ghetto to these sub-camps for slave labor. What's so striking about this is a menu. I'm sorry, the quality of it is rather poor. That's often the way with some of these digitized documents. What's so striking about this is how utterly fictional it is. I mean, if you can see it there, you see that there's each day the meals are meant to include beef, potatoes, vegetables, other a selection of documents, obsessed with documents, other selection of foods, and at the bottom there's a warning which says changes may be made. This is almost the Nazis mocking the inmates. I think it's really extraordinary. It's extraordinary that such a thing existed, and it's signed off by the camp doctor and so on. But everything we know about the camp suggests that nothing like this ever existed there in reality. But this is again a kind of small indication of this kind of stereotypical obsession with bureaucracy on the part of the Nazis. One of the things that we can find in ITS is information about some of these subcamps that are very little known. And I think we sometimes read about these camps in eyewitness accounts, survivor testimonies, and so on. Lots of people who survived because they were not sent to be murdered, but were sent to these slave labor camps, particularly at the final stages of the war. But places like Friedland, very few people have ever heard of these sorts of camps. And in ITS, you can find sketches of some of them, and here's one. It's not particularly informative. It's not particularly surprising, but gives you a sense of what this place looked like. Here's another one by comparison. This is the Gabersdorf subcamp, and you can see here the roughest of sketches. But again, it's quite interesting. It tells you above the railway line. You can see it says the buildings and the living quarters for the Volksdeutsche. So that means the civilian workers of supposedly ethnic Germans who were also working on the same site. And often concentration camp inmates and civilian workers were working at the same site. And there's also in ITS interesting post-war statements by civilian workers about what they saw and the treatment of camp inmates in the slave labor camps. One of the things that ITS did that was, I think, quite remarkable at the end of the war was to send out their employees into the field to retrace the steps of the so-called death marches. And I'll speak about this at greater length when we finally get to Belfast. But in ITS, you can find these very detailed maps, which today for historians and people who want to commemorate these events are an incredibly rich resource. So they set out to retrace the steps of the march, to try and discover where people had been killed en route, because something like a third of all the camp inmates who were still alive in January 1945 were dead by the end of the war, most of them shot at the side of the road for failing to keep up on the death marches. So in every locality across Germany and parts of Poland and Czechoslovakia, there were non-German former camp inmates being reburied in local cemeteries. And the military authorities ordered local mayors, the newly installed non-Nazi mayors, to provide them with records as to where these people were buried. And the ITS, although it didn't have the authority to exhume the bodies, when exhumations took place and reburials took place, they would attend and try and find identification marks on the bodies. Again, it was actually rather unusual for them to be able to make a positive identification. People were wearing concentration camp inmates with numbers on that were not necessarily their own numbers. They didn't have any other form of identification. Sometimes, I'll show you a few examples in a moment, things were found on them which might have been interesting but didn't necessarily tell you very much about who they were. So you can see accompanying the maps there are statements of the places where these inmates passed. So what you see here are effectively mobile concentration camps. At the end of the war, the inmates would have been seen across the whole of the countryside. So, I mean, this notion, which was in any way implausible, that nobody knew about what was happening in the camps, at the end of the war becomes completely impossible to believe, because these inmates from the camps in huge numbers were being marched across the whole of Germany. This one, from Flossenbürg to Cham, is an interesting one because it's the first one that the ITS undertook, and it's the one that they studied in perhaps most detail. There's a lot of documentation about the logistics behind what they did and what they discovered, and also quite a lot of material evidence of things that they found among the bodies when they were exhumed. There's a list of places. These, sometimes now we know that these are not entirely accurate in certain ways, but nevertheless, it gives you a very good indication of the routes and distances being traveled. This is not from the Death March, but this one comes from a little later, 1949, when a mass grave was found. There had already been mass graves identified at Dachau and other places, but the ITS attended several exhumations of bodies later on as well, when they were discovered, and tried again to identify bodies. This one comes from 1949. At the same time, I just wanted to mention this one. The Neuenkirchen shipyard is just outside Bremen in North Germany. It was the site of a huge subcamp of Neuengamme, the concentration camp in Hamburg, which was a submarine pen. So the camp inmates here were basically being forced to work on the building of submarines, U-boats, which I don't think they ever actually produced anything, but that's what they were. It's now a large commemoration center. And in the kind of shallow, sandy soil, again, when a construction firm was starting to do some new building in 1949, they disturbed the remains of what were obviously concentration camp inmates. And in the file in ITS relating to this, you can see these photographs from the exhumations. And I wanted to show them because the photographs are quite incongruous. I mean, here this policeman smiling at the camera in the middle. You see the sense of the harsh landscape. You can imagine the people working here, underfed and suffering, and here these people are smiling. At the front, you can see the photographer, and this is what he's photographing. You see the close-ups of skulls with bullet wounds and other marks in them of how people died. This is an example, a rare example of a letter found on a body. This is from the death march from Flossenbürg, which passed through Neuenburg vom Wald in Bavaria, and there was a large reburial where local Germans were forced by the Americans to exhume bodies, build coffins, and rebury in a proper ceremony the large number of corpses that were discovered locally. And here's another one, and this one decipherable, and you can see there the rather sad message that had been written on it. All we know is that this exists. We've no idea who wrote it or who it was addressed to. Other examples of mass graves I just wanted to show, because one of the other things that the local mayors had to do at the end of the war was to provide cemetery maps to show where non-German nationals had been reburied. And some of them are very simple, like the sketches of subcamps I showed you a moment ago. Some of them are really rather beautiful, like the one that we used at the as you were waiting to come into the event. Some of them are typical architectural drawings, as in this case, excuse me, you can hear my son playing FIFA next door. That's what you see here. I wanted to show, because in this particular case, Schörzingen, which was in the French zone of occupation in southwest Germany, subsequently was the site of a large Ehrenfriedhof, or a cemetery of honor, that was built by the French, where a large commemorative ceremony to rebury the victims took place shortly afterwards. I'll just end. I'm sorry this is such a rapid run through. I just wanted to give you a little sense of some of the things that you can find in ITS. I'll just end with this example from the child search branch. This is Lazar Kleinman, a young Hungarian-speaking boy from what's today Satu Mare in Romania, in northern Transylvania, at the time, and previously part of Hungary. He was the sole survivor of his family, all deported to Auschwitz. And at the end of the war, this photo was taken of him and many children like him at Kloster Indersdorf in Bavaria, which was a children's center run by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. And they took photos of the kids holding up their names where they knew them. Not all of them did. Some were too young to know, in the hope of tracing relatives. In Lazar's case, he couldn't, but he did get one thing he wanted, which was to move to England. And you can see this letter here that he sent from his new home in Manchester in 1949. Today he's still alive, aged now I guess about 92, and still doesn't really know what happened to his parents, and his siblings, but all presumed murdered in Auschwitz. So not an especially happy ending, but I'm afraid that's the nature of this topic. But I hope that what I've shown here, it just gives you a little taster of some of the extraordinary documentation that's to be found in ITS, and I'm of course very happy to take questions about any aspect of this at the end. So I'll hand over to Christine. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Dan. And I am going to now share my screen. Give me one moment. Okay, can everybody see that? Good, good, good. Okay, so, well, thank you to everybody who's joining us this evening. I'm really delighted to be able to provide a preview of the exhibition Fate Unknown, of course, that we developed in partnership with Dan and the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London a couple of years ago. And of course, it was based on some of the research he conducted for his forthcoming book of the same name. And we're also, of course, delighted to be able to partner on this event For Being Human with the Linen Hall Library, and to hopefully bringing a version of this exhibition to audiences in Belfast next year. This exhibition was on show in 2018 at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, and up to that point, it actually became our most visited exhibition. And I think this is because the issues we raise in the exhibition are at once specific to the Holocaust and the Second World War, because it, of course, traced the history of tracing efforts after the war. But it also revealed how legacies of missing and unknown fates resonate with people today. And also because I think the repercussions of the missing, both kind of at this macro level, political and humanitarian level, but also at the personal kind of micro level, are themes that are clearly applicable to other periods of conflict, war, and displacement. So, and it made sense for the library to curate this exhibition, since we are the only copy holder of the full digital archive of the International Tracing Service in the UK. And we've developed considerable expertise in being able to navigate it for historical and family research purposes, which of course Elise and Mary, my colleagues, are going to talk about shortly. And in many ways, we were driven both by academic research, including, of course, Dan's book project, and family research to curate this exhibition. And at the library, we have a remit to facilitate both. So it sort of brought these two initiatives together. So I won't be able to guide you through the entire exhibition. Of course, we want you to come and see it. So this is just a kind of a taste of what the themes that it covers. And we hope that when we bring it to Belfast and other cities in the UK, everyone will be able to visit the traveling version. I'm just going to advance. The exhibition begins by framing the history of tracing in some ways, as Dan has already laid out, amidst the chaos of the final days of the war, as militaries and relief workers and those who survived the events tried to navigate this new reality. We discuss the ambiguities of liberation and the ways in which millions of people were essentially somewhere other than where they wanted to be at war's end. And so how we tried to answer a very sort of deceptively simple question: how did people set about trying to find each other? And despite the seemingly impossible logistical challenges, we show the ways in which tracing efforts emerged and were linked to military occupation, humanitarian efforts, but also how different charities and organizations and also through publications tried to help within post-war occupied Europe and beyond. And since there was no central authority in place, relatives approached as many organizations as possible with information about the last known whereabouts of their family members. And the stories and collections we present demonstrate this, such as this advertisement here on the right, which was published in a Yiddish-speaking Yiddish newspaper in New York, where the writers were looking for their relatives from Israel. And we also highlight tracing work that was closely tied to relief and rehabilitation efforts, and that it was essentially a transnational affair. The exhibition also chronicles the centralization process of searching. This is essentially talking about the predecessor initiatives to the International Tracing Service, which I think Dan just sort of briefly mentioned, and rightfully so, because it's quite a complicated history. But we try to show how the Central Tracing Bureau, which was the predecessor to the ITS, coordinated initiatives among national and sort of zonal tracing offices by July 1945. And here we have a picture of Colonel Bowring, who led on some of these early efforts. The exhibition discusses some of the obstacles the searchers faced, and which of course Dan already alluded to, how the remnants of surviving documents were not always accurate or complete, that many victims and survivors shared the same name or spelled their name in numerous variations, and the fact that many had given false names and ages upon entering camps or other sites of persecution to liberating authorities. And this is an ambiguity that is still present in surviving documents and still poses challenges for those of us who assist family researchers today. The exhibition also examines several important special investigations or initiatives the ITS started to try and find missing people. For example, the investigations of the Death March routes, which Dan described, and the attempts to find graves of those who were considered UN nationals, and of course the work of the Child Search Branch, which was a special office of the ITS set up to work finding missing children. And among the children who found themselves alone or quote unquote unaccompanied at war's end were those who had survived concentration camps and children of foreign forced laborers. And parents searched for children who had been kidnapped by German authorities because they had been considered quote unquote racially suitable and Germanized. And through this fieldwork, the ITS identified thousands of children who belonged somewhere else, in their opinion, usually with their biological parents. And the collections and the exhibition described how the decision to remove a child from foster care was not easy and fraught with ethical and emotional challenges. And here I've just included one of the cases that we feature in the exhibition of Susie Talvey, whose mother wrote to the ITS after the war. And I'll just give you a moment to read it. It's quite poignant and heartrending. I think actually the Child Search Branch case files are among the most heartrending documents in the ITS collection, because in many cases there was no reunion between parent and child, as was the case here. And so we wanted to make sure that in the exhibition this work was highlighted. The exhibition also portrays the longer term legacies of the missing after World War II, because as my colleagues will describe next, the search for the missing or for unknown fates continues today. Documentary evidence of persecution, where it exists, assists with claims for compensation, for stolen property and other assets. Yet, because records are scattered around the world, let alone the challenges of naming that I pointed to earlier, among many other issues, this means that a search can take months or years or even decades. And in many cases, there are no relatives or descendants who have remained alive to carry on a search for the missing. So there are entire communities that were destroyed and that no one is essentially searching for. So throughout the exhibition, we wanted to try to give a sense of the scale of these efforts, which is not an easy thing to do, and definitely not an easy thing to do in the smaller kind of traveling version of this exhibition. But we also didn't want to lose sight of the individuals, both those who were or are missing and those who are or were doing the searching and who still may be doing the searching. And we see the inclusion of these individual stories as a memorial to those who were never found. And one such case is Gita Nussbaum, who was born in Latvia in March 1933. And from about 1936, she was in the care of her aunt and uncle, Sophie and Noah Haydn. And after the war, her parents, who had survived with her older sister as they managed to get to Corsica, searched for her but never found her. And her relatives actually came to my colleague Elise, who facilitated extensive research on her case, but her fate remains unknown. So finally, I just wanted to close with a few photos of visitors to the London exhibition, including Leslie Kleinman, whose story features in the exhibition and who Dan just described, and also Colonel Bowring's daughter, Caroline, who you can see also pictured here. Leslie came to give a talk at the library, and I've included a short link to his talk on YouTube if anybody would like to catch up on that. I'm also going to just leave you here with a few comments from visitors, which I hope demonstrate some of the impact of the exhibition. And before I hand over to my colleagues, I'd like to close by saying that we hope that the traveling version of this exhibition gives people a sense of this history and its lasting impact in the present. And we look forward to being able to take it on the road as soon as pandemic conditions permit, and of course, beginning in Belfast. The exhibition is going to be accompanied by a hands-on family research workshop, in addition to Dan's lecture, based on these rich resources. And a preview of this workshop and the resources we have, my colleagues are going to discuss in a moment. And if you're logging in now and you won't be in Belfast in 2021, or you don't think you will be, please have just drop in the chat any ideas or locations where you'd like us to come visit with this program. We'd be happy to try and bring the exhibition and the plans for the program to you as much as we can. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to my colleague, Elise, who I think I have to unmute. Oh, there she is. Okay.
Thank you very much for that, Christine, and hello everyone. Very disappointed not to be with you all in person now, but you know, 2020 is not working out brilliantly for everyone. I'm looking forward to when we can come across and meet in person. So, as Christine said, my name is Elise Bath, and I'm one of the senior ITS archive researchers at the Wiener Holocaust Library. The next section of this evening's talk comes from me and my colleague Mary, who is our other senior ITS archive researcher. I'm going to speak about how we use the ITS archive in the Wiener Holocaust Library now to facilitate family research, and then Mary is going to speak more about the online resources that are available for research now. And obviously those online resources are especially useful at the moment. Given the current situation, you can't come to institutions like the Wiener or the Lindenhall Library, and you can't meet with researchers like us in person. So Mary's going to talk about what you can do from home. So I'm going to share my screen now and show you some of the documents. Yeah. Okay, has that worked? Can you see me? Great, smashing. So I'm going to speak, as I said, I'm going to speak for a few minutes about how we use the archive mainly for family research. Mary and I, we do work with academics like Dan, supporting various research projects. And we also carry out research for internal purposes, such as providing documents for internal exhibitions that we produce. But most of our time is spent carrying out, looking for information for inquirers who are searching for details about what happened to people caught up in the Holocaust. Normally, we do this on behalf of relatives of victims, but we do also still do work for survivors who may be wanting to know details about their own persecution or that of their families, some of whom are claiming compensation for the crimes committed against them and their families. And since the Brexit referendum, we have also been helping people gather evidence to support applications to gain citizenship that their families lost through persecution. The ITS archive is very useful in carrying out these tasks because of the material it contains. And I feel like Dan and Christine have both shown quite good examples of that sort of material, but in a very broad sense, you can categorize it in two main ways: the Nazi and perpetrator documents from the time of persecution itself, so that's things like concentration camp records, death lists, transport lists, prison books, that sort of thing. And then the second very broad category is the post-war material, so for example from refugee and displaced persons camps, emigration lists, claims for financial assistance, and so on. Now, we repurpose these documents as tools of family research. So in so doing, a deportation list becomes a way to trace a person's path of persecution. A signature on a prisoner's registration card can become the last tangible trace of them. A page from a death book in a concentration camp record provides a person's date of death, enabling a family to observe their yahrzeit. A post-war application for financial aid gives you the names of a person's siblings, wife, family, children, allowing you to begin to rebuild a lost family tree. At times, just a single document gives enough clues to be able to piece together a person's path of persecution. In other cases, hundreds of pages of documentation exist, providing an extraordinary level of detail. And yet, in still others, there is just no trace of a person. The documentation surrounding their murder was either lost, destroyed, or never kept in the first place. And you can see how much this case meant to us as researchers, because I was also going to speak about Gita Nussbaum. So we know roughly what happened to her because we know where she was living, and we know what the Nazis and their collaborators did to the Jewish people living in that area. But there's just nothing about her murder, really. And the ITS archive is vast. I'm sure you're starting to get a sense of the scale of this archive. You know, it contains over 30 million documents relating to the experiences of over 17.5 million people. And yet these blank spaces do exist. And they can be particularly difficult to navigate for family members. In some cases, I've found that people find this silence and these spaces more fraught and more difficult to reconcile themselves to than actually finding the documentation and finally knowing what happened, you know, however dreadful that information might be. In terms of how well this family research tracing service is used at the library now, at the Wiener Holocaust Library now, we get a large number of requests for help. And each inquiry that we work through can take anything from a couple of hours to several months. We've also seen a real jump in inquiries since the COVID crisis has kicked off. I don't know if it's just that people working from home or in lockdown or in the various tier systems simply have the time now to deal with this and to put these inquiries in, but we have noticed a real spike. Mary and I have been continuing to work through cases remotely. We're working from home now, but we haven't stopped. But we do have, there's a huge amount of interest in this, and we do have a backlog of cases, and it can take several months for us to be able to put together a response to inquiries. So far in 2020, Mary and I have researched the experiences of 326 individual victims of the Holocaust. We've pulled 5,445 pages of material from the archive. So what we do is, once we've pulled the relevant material and take these documents, we carry out further research to put them in their historical context. We explain what they mean. We offer rough translations of the most salient sections. And then we put together narrative reports explaining what exactly happened to the person we've researched as best we can from the information we found. This report gets sent to the inquirer along with copies of the relevant documents from the ITS archive, further suggested reading, and links to online resources which might prove useful should the inquirer wish to carry on with further research. The impact that this work has on inquirers can be very significant. There can be quite dramatic outcomes. Sometimes, for example, inquirers discover that they are actually not the sole survivor of their family, as they have always thought, but they actually have relatives that they didn't know existed. We've had a few of these cases, and it's always remarkable to be involved with these reunions. we had one recently, one such reunion between branches of a family. A group of, one of the branches was in London and the other was in America. And the American side flew over to meet their new relatives, and they shared a meal, and they sent us a photo afterwards. And when they emailed, they said, "For the first time since 1938, our family has sat down to eat together, a small triumph over the Nazis." So even when there isn't a dramatic cross-Atlantic reunion, finally knowing what happened to a relative can be very impactful for people. Which camps they were sent to, where they died, can be deeply moving for inquirers. We regularly find out the person's middle name, say, or their precise date of birth, such basic details which have been entirely lost to their descendants. Even when there is no trace of a person, as with Gita, the efforts taken to search for them can be seen as acting as a form of commemoration in their own right, even if they are unsuccessful. And that can sometimes bring a small comfort, despite not being able to provide the answers. Gita is now remembered by more people. I know she existed, you all now know she existed, and that she was murdered. And I mean, it's not much solace, but it's not nothing either. I do think that has a value in and of itself. I've just got a few more minutes, so I thought I might talk through another case study that I've been working on this year. So this case was for a chap called Avigdor Kohnheim, known as Vic. The case started about this time last year, and it took me sort of 2 or 3 months of research before I'd found all that there was to be found in the ITS archive, or I think I did. I hope I did. I've worked on it for quite a while. This case was worked on behalf of a survivor, Vic, who as a 2-year-old had been deported from Berlin to Theresienstadt. He managed to survive his time in that ghetto concentration camp and came to the UK as a refugee in the immediate post-war period. And he lived in a children's home for child survivors in the UK for quite some years before relocating to North America. Now, there were some records in ITS connected to his own persecution. So this is the front cover of the transport list that he was on. So you can see the date of the transport and its destination there, Theresienstadt. And then this is the page on which he appears. I'm sorry, it's very, very dodgy scans and very small, but he is the person at the very bottom. You can just see Kohnheim Avigdor, and there's his date of birth. So you can see he was 2 years old when he was deported. And also, actually, the Wiener Holocaust Library's photo archive just happened to have some photographs of him from when he was living in the children's home in the UK after the war. Have I got them? Oh, yeah. So here's his list. Here's the documentation showing his arrival in the UK. And there he is. That's him on the very far left in the middle row. That's him at the children's home. And there he is on the left again, sucking his thumb, looking out the window. And here he is on the right, a couple of years later, looking a bit older. So that was obviously very interesting for Vic, and I think it was very powerful to sort of see the documents of showing his own deportation as a 2-year-old. But what was actually far more meaningful to him was the information that I found out about the rest of his family. So he knew very little about his father. He wasn't even sure of his father's name, and he knew nothing at all about his paternal family. And eventually, after several weeks of research, the ITS was able to churn out, it was found to contain 505 separate pages of documents that related to 17 of Vic's relatives, 13 of whom he had never heard of before. So his father was a man called Paul Stock, a Jewish butcher who died in Auschwitz. As well as this, I found traces of aunts, cousins, grandparents. And obviously I was in touch with Vic quite a lot during this process. It's a very long conversation that we had over the course of several months. And I got to know him and his family a little. And they've spoken for us at events since as well. And it's been very clear the impact of this work. His daughter spoke about a sense of sort of knowing where she comes from now. This was deeply impactful on the family in terms of their identity and how they see themselves and how they see themselves in relation to each other and the world. And I think now I just want to wrap up by sort of reflecting on that a little. And I don't know who of you in the audience have relatives who were caught up in the Holocaust. I don't know whether the ITS's archive holdings and the family tracing work that Mary and I can help with is actually of direct use use for you. But regardless, I think some of the issues raised by the discussions here are more broadly relevant. If you're interested in family history generally, it can really, really be a very fraught business. It can be deeply frustrating, hampered by lack of documents, hampered by family secrets, hampered by a fear of hurting someone if you ask them what happened to them and forcing them to remember painful memories, hampered by the COVID crisis. You can't come into institutions like ours and look at documents. You can't meet with us at the moment. And all of these difficulties and issues are really exacerbated if the people you're researching lived through, died during, or died because of sort of difficult histories, for want of a better term. So I suppose my final comment, thinking about the family research side of this, is that if you're doing such research, it's difficult, and I don't want to sound trite, but I think I'm about to. I think it's worth being kind with yourself and recognizing the difficulties that this sort of work entails and the difficulties it can bring up. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Mary, who will be able to continue the conversation.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I am sure that a lot of you are really interested in how you can advance your own research and where you can begin your own search. And our hope is, when we are finally able to come to Belfast, would be to host some family research meetings and be able to do some breakout meetings as well, so that you can meet with us individually. If there were specific family members that you wanted to search, if you had specific questions of maybe roadblocks that you've come across as you researched, and maybe we could help you with next steps as well. In the meantime, until we can get to Belfast and be able to meet with you individually, there are some great online research resources that I wanted to share with you. So let me share my screen. So the Arleston Archive, which is the new name for the International Tracing Service, has recently made available many of their records online. And this is a great starting point if you have family members who were caught up in the Holocaust. It's not an in-depth search tool. It's kind of a surface level. So it will give you a good idea if there's further information to be found in the archive. And just to show you an example of the kind of material that you can find in here, I'm just gonna type in somebody who I've worked on previously, just to give you an idea of the kind of information that you can find in here. This is a gentleman who, hopefully you can see this okay, who was in Buchenwald, and this set of documents right here are records related to his time in Buchenwald, his incarceration. So there's various documents related to that camp. You can see this is the form that was filled out when he first arrived in Buchenwald with his pertinent information. Sometimes they're extensively filled out, sometimes they're very basic. Sometimes in this case, they include a photograph as well. For a lot of family members, just as Elise said, just being able to see this level of detail about their family members that maybe they never knew, it's a lot for people. And in some documents, there are signatures, and signatures are a deeply personal thing. And so sometimes just seeing your family member's signature for the first time can be a lot to deal with. So just something to keep in mind as you're going through the documentation of what's available. Just very quickly clicking through just to give you a sense of the information that's in here. Sometimes there's maps associated with the documents. They're trying to do a lot of geotagging of information, so people can learn more broadly about the items that are in here. Let me see if I can find some more documents to show you. This specific document is a personal items list. This would be as somebody moved to a new camp, they would list out any material that they brought with them. And in this case, this gentleman did not have anything that he came with, but you can see an example of, as I said, some of these documents have the individual's signature on them. There's information related to concentration camps in here. There's information post-war cards as well. So after the war, as people were registered, so tracing could begin, so they could claim aid. There's registration cards like this one here, where people give a summary of their experiences during the war. In this case, this individual went to the US afterwards. So you can easily see in one spot a basic history of this individual. So this resource is available through the Arleston Archives website, and we will be sending out this link so you can use it anytime. As I say, it's just a surface level search tool. There's not going to be extensive information. For example, Elise showed you a deportation list. Lists like that have not been put on here. It's just very simple information like this. So it's a good starting point if you don't know where your relatives went through, if you're not sure. Family members sometimes are listed out. So definitely start here. You can also search by location if you're interested in, if your family was from a small village, what happened to that village. You can look up and see, and you can look by the location if there's any information in there about that location. You can search by subject if there's specific subjects that you were interested in. You can also do that as well. And as you go through and you're looking at information that you come across, so this is again more Buchenwald information. Also keeping in mind with camp records, there's not records available for every camp. A lot of camps, their records were destroyed after the war or during the war or just were never found. So certain camps we have extensive information on, other camps we have nothing. So as you're looking through here and you're trying to understand what stuff is, especially if you don't read German or if it's in another language, the International Tracing Service, the Arleston Archives, have set up an e-guide where you can go through and search. So we were just looking at this red card, which I explained is a effects list as somebody checks into a camp. So you can go to the e-guide resource that Arleston Archives has created and try to find that card. And they have a very extensive search tool. So you can go section by section and it will explain what is on this card. So even if you don't speak German, you can very quickly understand the material that's contained in there. So don't feel that just because you don't speak German that you can't do this research for yourself. And it's very extensive on what information, what kinds of cards that they have in here. You can search, I imagine a lot of the records you'll find will be concentration camp records. That's why I clicked that. But there's a lot of information on here. So definitely it's a good place to start as you're trying to get your head around everything that you come across as you do your research. So that's just a good way to kind of step your toe into the water of what's available until we can get to Belfast to be able to help you. And I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point. But in the meantime, I am going to hand off to Jason from Belfast as soon as I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Sorry. One moment. Sorry, Christine. Thank you.
At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to
It disappeared into the abyss. Sorry. Thank you.
Has that worked?
Yes,
That's
all good.
Okay, good evening from Belfast. Someone was commenting earlier on my professional setup, which is great because it really gives the illusion that I know what I'm talking about, even if I don't in some cases. In some ways, I feel like the square peg in tonight's round hole, because Belfast has only really a very small, if any, left at all of a Jewish community. And so the history of the Holocaust is not something really that looms large in our memory. Indeed, our main cemetery here, Belfast City Cemetery, has a Jewish section, which if you were to go there today, and I was there a few days ago, it's secluded by a huge wall and behind a locked gate. And so in that regard, it's very much a hidden history in the truest sense of the meaning in Belfast. However, from time to time, the library has dealt with aspects of Holocaust history. Back in July, for example, we were due to host an exhibition from the Polish embassy here in Belfast on a man called Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who had planted himself inside the Auschwitz death camp. Unfortunately, the library was closed during July and August, and so we weren't able to host that exhibition, but we do plan to resurrect that one in the future. We do also hope to host a separate exhibition here in January, February to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. And we're keeping our fingers crossed that we'll be able to reopen by then. Now, Belfast may not have a Holocaust history per se, but we have suffered at the hands of Nazi violence, or more specifically, Luftwaffe violence, when we were extensively bombed during the Second World War, with a loss of around 1,000 lives and huge displacement of people in the city, including my own family. And it's actually the reason why I live in a certain part of Belfast today as a direct result of that. But Belfast is also a city emerging from a more recent conflict where issues of history and memory have become a daily battleground, really, in the emerging political landscape. And within that, then, here, people, I would argue, are acutely aware of their own family history as it forms part of the building blocks of their identity, which in Northern Ireland obviously can be often fraught with tension. And so therefore, it's in this context, really, that the Linen Hall Library exists. So what is the Linen Hall Library? I'm conscious that I'm speaking to an audience here, and perhaps 90+% of you probably have never heard of the Linen Hall Library. Certainly have never been there. But I've shared there a quote from Seamus Heaney, a world-renowned poet from here in Northern Ireland. He says, "The very words the Linen Hall Library represent not just books, but better hopes for the way we live." Seamus Heaney was a patron and an honorary member towards the end of his life of the Linen Hall Library. We are a truly unique institution founded in 1788. This year was to be our 232nd birthday. We had a lockdown birthday, so to speak. We had a lecture planned to mark that birthday. It ended up being an online sort of thing, so we even had a lockdown birthday this year. We're the oldest library in Belfast, the only remaining library in Ireland that still generates a proportion of its income from membership funds. However, we are free to enter. Anyone can walk in off the street and utilize the books and the cafe. We're famous for our cafe as well. And we're housed in a stunning Victorian former linen warehouse in the picturesque Donegal Square across from Belfast City Hall. The image which I'm showing you here is of the old white linen hall, which, if you've ever been to Belfast, or if you've ever seen any footage of Belfast or images, the current Belfast City Hall, you'll remember a huge big dispute in 2012 over the Union flag being removed from the top of Belfast City Hall. This is the original building which was on that site prior to the building of Belfast City Hall, and that was where the Linen Hall Library was situated. We are now currently across the street in an equally impressive building. So we have a radical and an Enlightenment foundation, and prized our independence, and maintained the principle that our resources are owned by the community and for the community. The Linen Hall is renowned for its unparalleled Irish and local studies collection, ranging from comprehensive holdings of early Belfast and Ulster printed books to the 350,000 items in the Northern Ireland political collection, the definitive archive of the recent Troubles, as it's referred to in Northern Ireland. As well as being a library and an archive, the Linen Hall is also an accredited museum. And so we host regular exhibitions at the venue, of which we hope that this project will eventually become one. So the Linen Hall has become a primary destination for those wishing to research their family history here in Northern Ireland. Although we wouldn't be the first place that people would come to. People would often go to the Public Records Office first, and there are various other institutions, but we are up there. And I want to just take you through just very briefly some of the resources that we hold, which may be of interest to some people here in the audience. Unfortunately, due to the library's closure, it hasn't been possible for me to get some images of the actual material that I'm going to be talking about. Instead, I provided just some stock images, really, just to keep you entertained while I'm going on. So the first one, which is of interest, is a births, marriages, and deaths index, which somebody, I mean, a long time before I had started working in the Linen Hall Library, somebody had actually went through the Belfast Newsletter, which is the oldest surviving newspaper in the British Isles, actually, and has actually by hand written out births, deaths, and marriages into an index, which we have housed in these lovely little drawers on display in the Linen Hall Library. So until 1864, it wasn't compulsory to register births, marriages, or deaths, and so newspaper entries are often sometimes the only record if church records aren't in existence. There are far more entries for deaths and marriages in this collection than there are for births, and this is because there was a very high infant mortality rate, and people would often only enter a notice from the newspaper if they felt that the child had a good chance of survival. Another thing which is worth pointing out is that in the marriage entries, it's often the case that the wife's name hasn't been provided. An example, I would argue, of the anonymity of women throughout history. So this is quite a unique collection, as all the information from the newspaper entry has been copied, as I say, onto a card by hand, and it's housed in alphabetical drawers. As well as the transcribed index, which I've mentioned, we also have an extensive newspaper collection, which is worth checking for births, deaths, marriages, or notable incidents. I've spent the last 10 years, outside of my role in the Linen Hall Library, I'm kind of an historian in my own right. I've spent the last 10 years researching Belfast's role in the First World War, as opposed to the Second. And for that research, I've went through the three main local newspapers for every single day during the First World War, really extracting killed in action lists, details of men who were wounded, and notable incidents. And it has literally taken me 10 years. So I'm kind of well versed on the newspaper side of things. Street directories are another one which the Linen Hall Library holds. The earliest street directories which we hold are from the beginning of the 19th century, when they were sort of produced sporadically rather than annually. And they were not published really annually until the 20th century. But in the 20th century editions, there's an alphabetical list of streets with the names of householders. And this is followed by an alphabetical list by surname of all the householders in Belfast. So it's a really useful tool. The information lists only really the head of the house and his or her profession. And there's no other details really about the family. But there's also a list of trades and professions, as well as limited companies. So if, for example, you're looking for all the music teachers, for example, in Belfast, or all the bakers in Belfast, you can actually do that through the Belfast Street Directory. As well as entries for Belfast, there's also details for businesses and households, which cover the rest of Ulster within these directories. And the last of these street directories was published in 1995, so fairly recent, Gravestone inscriptions are another useful tool which we would offer to people in the library. There are three principal authors really whose works and whose research is held in the library's genealogical collection. The first of these is a man called Clark. His work was in County Down, covering many of the graveyards there in County Down, and also a large part of County Antrim. These volumes are particularly useful as they cover graveyards which are no longer in use. The second key writer on gravestones is the former Belfast Lord Mayor, former Sinn Féin Lord Mayor from Belfast, who's actually a historian as well in his own right. And he's compiled great histories of Milltown, Balmoral, and Belfast city cemeteries, and has done great work really on uncovering some of the hidden histories which I spoke about at the beginning of this talk. Fourth on the list here is Griffith's valuation. A number of land valuations were carried out in Ireland in the 19th century. The earliest of these was the tithe allotments, which were undertaken in the 1830s. So all landowners, regardless of religion, had to pay a tithe to the established church, which was the Church of Ireland. These taxes cover only agricultural land and were not payable in towns or cities, and so the source is limited. But the penal laws, which forbade both Presbyterians and Catholics from owning land, were relaxed in the 1830s, and the tithe allotment survey then was undertaken to ensure that all payments were being made. So the monies gathered for this were used for the relief of the poor and destitute in each area. Griffith's valuation itself was undertaken mainly in the 1860s, and in the 30 years since the tithe allotments, much had changed really. There'd been emigration from Ireland, primarily to America, on an unprecedented scale as a result of the Great Irish Famine. So all 32 counties of Ireland are indexed in the valuation, and these can be searched at the Linen Hall Library. A slightly unusual one is what we call the Blackwood pedigree. So a man called Reginald Blackwood, who was born in a place called Seaford in County Down, not to be confused with Seaford in Sussex in England, was the president of the Linen Hall Library during the 1950s. He was actually a qualified solicitor, but he never practiced as such, because he devoted much of his time to genealogy and local history. His major work was a collection of over 100 volumes of manuscript family histories for notable families in Ulster, which he then donated to the library. So it's there's a slim chance, obviously, that the history of the family that you would be searching for would be contained within that, but occasionally it does happen. Printed family histories are another one. So if anyone completes their family tree or their family history, we do encourage them to donate it to the Linen Hall Library, and we do keep those. I'm not clear how many we actually have at the moment, but it contains, a number of English, Irish, and Scottish families. Yeah, I'll just gloss over that. And also then just some miscellaneous collections. So the Flax Growers List, for example, a fairly random one, the Flax Growers List from 1796. You never know when you might need a Flax Growers List from 1796. The Census of Ireland from 1659. I mean, the Irish census is quite an unusual one, because obviously during the violence during the Irish Revolutionary period, we lost a lot of our archives due to the shelling of the forecourts in Dublin. And so a lot of the census have been lost. And so often when you're researching Irish family history, you're kind of plugging gaps or looking for sources to plug gaps with. The one that I've shown on the screen here is the Dictionary of Irish Biography, useful really for researching prominent individuals and prominent families. And then just finally, we've recently, I think, lockdown and the COVID situation has forced us, as tonight has, forced us online with our events, but it's also forced our genealogical collection online in some respects. And so we're now promoting a remote search service, which we never had before. I think the Public Records Office in Belfast offers something similar, but the Linen Hall Library is now breaking into this ground as well. So we offer a limited search service for very specific information, which can be clearly identified from our records. So you can search our records on our website through our catalog, And the library can also provide you with a list of the records which we hold in terms of our genealogy. To carry out this kind of search, what we would require would be the full name of an ancestor, their approximate date of birth and or death, if possible, and also their place of birth or the parish or townland in which they lived. I mean, we don't employ a genealogist per se, but we do have very keen staff who'd be willing to undertake occasional searches. And just finally, you know, if anybody who does want to follow up on any aspect of this, you can email me at jason.burke@linenhall.com. I mean, I'm a mere pleb of the outfit. I organize the events and the exhibitions and stuff, but I do have a great team of colleagues and experts who I can pass on more specific queries to if I can't help myself. So I'll just unshare my screen here and hand back to Christine.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks. That's really fascinating, and it's interesting to see the kind of the ways you work are in very similar to how we work. And I also sort of picked up on the idea of keeping the family trees that people are completing. And we've talked about different ways of cataloging that in our own collections. We have, you know, sort of discrete family histories and collections of documents that we've done for people over the years. And, you know, how to make that available for other researchers as they come back and start doing their own family research. And, you know, as Elise may have mentioned, you know, as she mentioned, there are sometimes sort of reunions of distant, you know, family, and that is partly facilitated by keeping our own really good records of people who've been searching. So it's very interesting to hear that. So I think at this point we have about 10 minutes. Thank you to everyone who's been able to stay. This is a slightly longer event than a normal 1 hour event, but we wanted to make sure that all of the resources that everyone has was highlighted, and to kind of give you a sense of what we'd like to do when we could do this in person. So we had a couple questions already early on in the chat. I think those were probably directed to Dan. I'm just scrolling up from all the great ideas that everybody has put in for where we can actually come, where we can bring the exhibition and bring this program throughout the UK. I'm just kind of coming back to, there was a question from Stephanie about how many of the 3 million case files have been closed. So I don't know if one of my co-panelists wants to take that on.
I don't know the answer to that. By closed, that means that I assume the question means that the searching has ended, either that they've found the person or decided that the person is missing and can't be found. I just don't know. I don't. Maybe Elise knows.
No, thanks for your confidence in me there, Dan. But I'm afraid I don't either. And it's a question of sort of when is a piece of research ever closed? Because there are case files in the ITS archive that might have the term closed stamped on it, but then Mary and I are looking at it later, you know, decades later. So when can you even consider a research case fully closed? I think that was just a get out answer, because I'm not sure of the actual answer.
Was a question from Rachel about the Red Cross and why the Red Cross was so reluctant to open the archive. I'm going to pass that back to Dan.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, that's a very big and complicated question. And actually, Jennifer Rogers, who's also here this evening in the audience, is probably better placed than me to answer that. But I think that first of all, officially speaking, the Red Cross has a neutral humanitarian mandate, and in its own words, it did not have the resources to run a research outfit. You know, it was meant to be a tracing service, and therefore it was reluctant to open itself up to becoming something that it couldn't really fund and didn't have the expertise to run. That's the kind of official line. The unofficial line is that because it was going to be embarrassed about what was going to be uncovered there. There had already been, in the years before that, a good deal of debate amongst historians about the role of the Red Cross during the war and during the Holocaust, and its failure to aid concentration camp inmates, for example, until very late on in the war. And after the war, you see, particularly in the 50s, when a special register office was opened at Arolsen for indemnification cases and providing certificates of incarceration to former inmates and so on, to facilitate emigration and claims for compensation from the West German government. You also see the Red Cross, the ITS, under the aegis of the Red Cross, providing documentation to former war criminals in ways that would today be considered, and then of course also rather embarrassing. The fact is also that this is harder to explain, but the internal culture of the ITS after the 70s and 80s in particular, under the directors that were then there, turned the institution into a closed archive. In the 1980s and 90s, they stopped producing the annual report. They spoke only to themselves, and by the time the ITS was open, and one of the reasons why many institutions like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum were pushing for ITS to be opened, was that they were taking years to answer inquiries, literally years to get back to people. And the part of their reluctance, I think, would be simply exposure about how dilatory they were behaving as an institution. That's a very short answer. I think all of those factors apply. Well, I've written quite a lot about this in the forthcoming book, so you can read more about it then.
We had a bit, just to say, we had a bit in that article that we did for a conference last year, I think, in Geneva, about the histories of the Red Cross. And there was I just pulled up the quote that President Maurer of the ICRC in 2012, he, in reflecting after the ITS was opened to researchers, he said, the Red Cross's, quote, determination to place human rights and human dignity at the forefront of its endeavor prompted the tracing service early on to take steps to shield the victims and survivors from inappropriate and obtrusive curiosity. But then he further conceded that as views changed, this is a part of his quote, it was realized that giving researchers and other parties access to the archive represented a necessary and justified expansion of the service's work. So you can see that, kind of reflecting on, these reasons of, of humanitarian, of privacy and things like that. Thanks.
Yeah, particularly in Germany, I think that the data protection legislation in Germany has often, which is the most stringent in Europe, has often worked to shield people who've got things to hide.
There were a couple questions about kind of the practicalities of the searching. First, a nice comment from Helen about continuing with the online events even after the pandemic is over, which I think we will certainly consider doing that, and hopefully doing some sort of hybrid events as well, which I think we've also had experience of, and that seems to work decently well. Sarah's asking about the translations of the source document and is helpfully volunteering. So, my colleagues can kind of weigh in on that if they'd like to, about who does the translations. I know the answer, but I don't want to steal your thunder.
Mary, do you want to go for this one?
Sure, we do the German translations ourselves. Depending on the documents, we do reach out to other colleagues in the office, depending on the language assistance that we need. I've actually even reached out to my childminder at one point when I was working on Czechoslovakian documents and I didn't have any language skills, or anybody in the office who had that. But we also do keep a roster of volunteer translators that when we need something more professional than your childminder translating a document, that we reach out to for larger projects. So if you were interested in volunteering, if you just email one of us, we'll happily put you in touch with the volunteer coordinator in our office.
Thanks. A question from Helen. Do you know how many people were found or reconciled through the ITS? I suspect this is similar to the closed case question and will probably have a similar response.
It will. Actually, I think, for example, in that report that I showed from 1949, in the annual reports, which I'm not sure if they're available online yet, but I don't know. But anyway, in those reports, they do show year by year how many cases that they've managed to resolve, i.e., where they've had a positive outcome, whether the person was found alive or dead. And I think that continues up to the present day. So it may be that on the Arolsen Archive website, you can find those statistics. I'm not sure. Off the top of my head, I can't say. Again, I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact figures, but it's a small percentage of the total number of requests, and of course an even smaller percentage of the total number of people whose names are there in the central name index.
One thing as well that complicates that question is that since the opening of the archive and the distribution of multiple digital copies around the world, various countries have their own copy now, that we don't all necessarily know what the other copy holders are doing all the time. So, at the Wiener Holocaust Library, we have our own records, Yad Vashem will have their own, USHMM will have their own, so that complicates things as well. But yes, unfortunately, I couldn't even take a guess, to be honest. Sorry.
Thanks, Elise and Dan. So a question from Alan, and then if that might be our last one, and then I just have one question to Jason, actually, before we close. As some of those who undertook the death marches were British military personnel, such as those who were at Monowitz, will their records be held by the Arolsen Archives, or will they be held by the National Archives? Elise or Mary, would you be able to weigh in? Or maybe Dan, if you want to jump in as well.
Well, I can answer that one.
Okay, go ahead. Go on.
But both, in fact, so that as Alan, I can see, knows from the question, there was a British POW camp called E715 at Monowitz, which was the slave labor camp, Auschwitz III. And the records of the British POWs who were held there are at the National Archives, and at the Imperial War Museum, but they're also in the ITS as well.
So that's good to kind of reinforce that amongst the ITS collection, there are also duplicates. It's not only materials that are unique to the ITS, there are also materials that have been copied from and then copied by other archival collections. So just one question to Jason. I mean, one of the things that we've experienced at the library during the lockdown, and maybe this is because and during the pandemic in general, whether we're in lockdown or some form of it, is that people tend to look more at their family histories, and we've gotten more, an increase in requests. So I wonder if that's a similar, if you're finding that, you and your colleagues in Belfast, if you're finding that similarly to be the case.
To borrow a phrase from Professor Dan Stone, I don't know, because I wouldn't be the person that they would come to, but I mean, I can speak from my own experience. The lockdown kind of gave me time and space in order to focus on my own family tree. So, I mean, if it was true for me, I'm sure it was true for a lot of other people. And I know that, for example, the National Archives at Kew, for example, had a great had a great facility available for a while there, where you could download documents for free in the absence of being able to get to the archives. Unfortunately, the Linen Hall just would never be in a position to offer anything like that. And the fact that we're able to offer this new kind of remote searching facility is groundbreaking in and of itself, for the Linen Hall Library. But to answer your question, honestly, I don't know, but I do hope that a lot of people have been availing of it,
Good. I don't know if Elise and Mary, you want to jump in on that as well, add anything on that point. Okay, there's a little mute button has gone off.
Yeah, definitely people have had the time. We've seen a real spike in inquiries, and I think there's more to it as well, without wishing to get all sort of armchair psychologists about this whole thing. I think it's a time to reflect on identity, on family, on what makes us who we are. And I think that might be triggering some reflections and being the catalyst to bring these questions to the forefront of people's mind. And practically speaking, people have a bit more time sometimes at the moment.
Great, thanks, Elise. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm just going to pop the link to the survey that we would love to have everyone's feedback on. This is from the Being Human Festival. So if there are no other questions, just want to thank everyone for taking part. Thank my fellow panelists. I've sort of done a multiple hat here, kind of chairing it and also speaking. So sorry if that's a bit odd, but it seems to have worked. Thank you to everyone for taking part and for your excellent questions. And especially thank you to the Linen Hall Library. And we are really hoping to be able to do this in person in a fuller sense. I mean, this is really meant to just give you a hint of this program that we'd like to develop, as an in-person event, a series of events next year, and also in multiple locations across the UK. So please stay tuned on our website for more information. And thank you again to everybody, and good night.
Thank you.